Okay, so we were just looking at Carl Rogers's proposition number 9, in which people are seen as developing individuals who develop a sense of self. Proposition number 10 says that people attach values to their experiences. And sometimes these values are values that they have directly experienced themselves, and in other cases they are values that they have introjected from other people. This is what Rogers called the conditions of worth. So if I'm not very good at sport and my parents wanted me to be very good at sport, I may come to see myself as lacking in sporting prowess, and this being a very negative thing. Um, so I have, if you like, a down view of myself. But this isn't something that I've directly experienced for myself, it's something that I've introjected from the other people around me. As we go through life and we experience different things, some of the things we experience we take in and organise as part of our self structure, and other things we don't pay any attention to and we ignore. So there may be elements of ourselves and our behaviour which we don't actually take account of, which we don't incorporate into our self structure. So we might be particularly good at music, for example, but we don't see this as a valuable side of ourselves and we don't pay it any attention, perhaps because significant other people in our lives likewise don't see it as an important aspect. Moving on to 17, which is getting on to how people can change given all this is going on. According to Rogers, if certain conditions exist in which there is a complete lack of any threat to people's self-structure, they don't feel that they're being criticised or judged in any way, then they will be able to look at themselves and look at experience they've had which don't fit with them, their past experience, and they can start to revise their structure, their view of themselves, to try and incorporate such experience. An example of this would be someone who, as a child, was not allowed to ever be angry, and whose parents themselves become quite irate if the child shows any signs of anger. Perhaps saying to the child, you mustn't get angry, that's naughty, you need to stay calm. Now, we all do get angry, so what the child is forced to do is to deny an aspect of their experience, which is that on occasion they do feel angry, they do want to shout at people, but they have come to see themselves as a placid person that doesn't get angry. So they do not label this emotion, they don't recognize it. And this may not lead to a very healthy adjustment as an adult. The person may be quite incongruent in certain situations, provided that a therapist can provide those non-judgmental conditions and allow the person to explore all of their experience and allow for the fact that yes, they can be angry and they can express this anger and this is perfectly allowable, and in these conditions the person can recognize this perhaps for the first time and come to incorporate this information into their self-structure. So again, we see within Rogers a theory of change. How do people shift? How do they move? It's interesting to speculate for a moment here in seeking to think about how different theories can be integrated, what these threats to the self-structure might actually be. How would you feel threatened? Perhaps by other people pointing out something which you don't accept, offering an interpretation that's too early, that I'm not ready for, that I then find a challenge, find difficult to accept, may resist what the therapist is saying, and so on. Thinking about the therapeutic relationship, there have been quite detailed accounts of relationship and how it works. Clarkson in particular described aspects of therapeutic relationship in some detail. And the kind of relationship we've just been talking about, the client-centered relationship in which the therapist tries to be genuine to the client, and the client is seen as being able to be genuine in return in the right conditions, Clarkson referred to as the person-to-person relationship. Clarkson also refers to the transpersonal, the developmentally needed, the transference-countertransference, and the working alliance. Sometimes when people look at this view of Clarkson, people often see these 5 aspects of relationship almost like some kind of an eclectic theory. So people imagine that you could be working with a client using working alliance, and then with another client you might work in a transference countertransference relationship, and with yet a third client you might be person to person. However, if we see these things as working in an integrative fashion, then they are all valid aspects of a relationship, and they will all be present to some extent in any given relationship. So no matter what model of therapy I'm using with any particular client, there will be an element of working alliance. There may be more or less transference countertransference issues going on. It may be partly a developmentally needed relationship. There may be aspects of that relationship which are genuine person to person, and there may be transpersonal aspects as well. So again, taking Clarkson's notions and looking at these different aspects of relationship, we get further insight, into this notion of relationship between the therapist and the client. Transference then is one of those aspects that Clarkson mentioned in relation to the relationship between the client and therapist. And remember that Clarkson was taking on and adding to the notion of relationship from the person-to-person client-centered view. So think about the transference countertransference issue then for a second. Huprich gives a quotation in his 2009 book about transference. That is an inaccurate perception, representation, and interaction the patient experiences with the therapist, often reflecting the patient's experience with someone similar in his or her past. So transference is about taking some representation of previous relationships from the past and somehow transferring or applying that perception representation to the therapist. And similarly, countertransference is said to be where therapists come to experience their patients in many ways and develop particular affects, desires and attitudes towards them. So almost the opposite of transference, where the therapist is putting some attitude from themselves back on to the client. So very interesting notions of things from the past being transferred and operating in the current relationship. So again, within this view of transference, we can see an explanation of individuals and how they come to perceive and represent relationships and how that develops through time. In a very interesting book on the therapeutic relationship in the cognitive behavioral psychotherapies, um, which is an interesting title since many people often seem to think that CBT doesn't involve relationship, there is an interesting chapter by Miranda and Anderson. And Miranda and Anderson are two authors who've spent a lot of time as psychologists working in the psychology laboratory to look at this issue of transference. And they have done a number of experimental studies where they claim to have demonstrated transference-like processes in the social psychology laboratory. And they say mental representations of the self held in memory are tied to representations of significant others. Transference is the process by which such mental representations are triggered by social contextual cues and applied to new individuals. So almost exactly the same statement, in fact, as the one by Huperich in his psychodynamic account, being given by social psychologists based on their work in the social psychology laboratory. Moving on to Alessandra Lemmer, who in her introductory texts states, we all have formative early interpersonal experiences that contribute to the development of dynamic templates, or if you like, schemata, of self-other relationships. These templates are encoded in the implicit procedural memory system. So this is a very psychological language that Lemmer is using. Lemmer is in fact a psychologist, clinical psychologist. She suggests that our past early experiences form templates or schemas about ourselves in relationship with other people, and these templates are encoded into our implicit procedural memory system, which is a fairly fundamental memory system which operates very early on in life, even before linguistic representation has developed. And she then goes on to say, therapeutic change is said to result from the elaboration and re-evaluation of current models that are implicitly encoded as procedures, leading to a change in the procedures that the patient uses in his relationships. So this is about exploring these representational schemas that we have developed in early life and gaining insight into them and looking at how we apply them to people and learning from that and coming to reevaluate those models and implicit encodings so that we can change how they operate in our current relationships. Very interesting to reflect at this point as well back to that statement in the 19 propositions from Carl Rogers about there not needing to be any threat when people are looking at these processes, so that they can examine their current self-structure and who they are, and if there is a lack of threat within that relationship, they can examine those structures and go about changing. So I'm going to break off at that point and take up in the next part.